Are the bumps in F1 2021 really random or RNG? So recently then, lots of esports drivers have been not very happy because there was quite a big league race in around Barcelona on F1 2021. And there was a seemingly random bump on the entry to turn one where the drivers would hit it and launch into the air and just obviously completely miss the next corner because all four wheels would be off the ground when they need to be hitting the brakes. Now, obviously, this is alarming. All these sports drivers were kind of complaining about it and saying, you know, we don't mind that the bumps are there. It's the fact that it's random. It's the fact that it didn't happen the 100 other laps that I did, which you can understand from an esports point of view is very frustrating. So I thought I'd make a little video and try and figure out whether it's truly just random, whether it's a bug, whether it can be avoided, just kind of trying to figure out what the hell is going on with this random bump. Now, I will say I'm only going to concentrate on, well, for this video, just this one bump, but just bumps in general that launch you into the air in this game, but not any curbs that can make the rear end loose. We know in this game that we've got some brand new floor downforce calculations, live calculations within the physics of the game, which can cause you, if you bottom out or if you just hit a curb weird, it can cause you to lose a load of rear downforce and then you spin out or you have oversteer. That is a completely separate thing. That is entirely separate to this. This is specific to bumps that launch you in the air. Now for this one, I'm going to be concentrating on that turn one of Spain, and that is the only one I'm going to be doing for this. Obviously, I need to narrow it down as much as I possibly can, just because otherwise there's just too many variables involved. I need to take out as many as I can. So we're going to concentrate entirely on that one. So let's do some tests now then, to just try to figure out what is going on with this. So my first test is just an exploratory test there, just to find out how we can make this happen, because I've never had it myself personally. I've kind of hit that dip and been unstable, but I've never been launched into the air like the esports drivers are seemingly getting. So after a few attempts, 23 attempts I will say, on the 24th attempt I did finally manage to make it happen, and on doing a little bit of analysis, a bit of a fly around the car, a few replay angles, it does seem to be that the car bottoms out. I mean, it's probably what we'd have all assumed anyway, but we know for a fact now it bottoms out. It seems that the kind of splitter of the car, the floor of the car, hits the ground and launches into the air and all four wheels come off the ground. So we know that for sure now. There seems to be some sort of raised part, I guess, on the track, and obviously the shape of the track isn't really the issue here. You know, we're not saying that the track needs to be perfectly, you know, pool table level, but we know for a fact now how it happens. So we can use that line now consistently, and we're always going to just be trying to make our car right in the middle where we now know that bump is. I'm going to try and make our car launch for these various other tests. Just before we get into the next test, I'm going to ask you to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. This channel is full of detailed oriented F1 2021 content. So if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy the other content on my channel. So do subscribe. Let's get into the next test. So the first thing I'm going to do then is run a default setup. So the last one was an esports setup. This one is a default setup, the completely standard setup you get when you just jump into the car. Now actually, on my second test, I get launched into the air, but you know, I think that was just a bit of luck there really, and it turns out I did 31 attempts and we actually got launched into the air 5 times with a default setup, which was 16% of the time. That's actually much higher than I was expecting, but again, we are literally driving off the circuit, so obviously you wouldn't get it at 16% of the actual laps you do, but quite a high percentage of the time considering we're on the standard setup there. The next test I wanted to run was just to see if we could avoid it completely. So I've raised the ride height all the way up to 11. I've also put the stiffness all the way up to the maximum, thinking that, you know, we don't want the car to get compressed at all. We want it to hold its height and hopefully glide straight on over this bump. And actually, that's exactly what we found. 44 attempts I did, and we didn't get launched into the air even once. So we now know that it can be completely avoided with setup. So that is good to know, and now our next job is to try and make it happen as much as possible with setup, just to try and, for starters, figure out what parts of the setup make it worse, and then also once we've got a worst case scenario test, we can then run a few other tests to see if anything else is making a difference. The reason we do that is because realistically, if, you know, 5% of the time it's happening, we need to run hundreds or thousands of tests in order to test other variables. We're trying to make it happen as much as possible so we can run some other tests. So let's try and find a worst case scenario setup then. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run, obviously, the opposite of what we did last time. The lowest you can possibly get, also with the softest suspension you can possibly get. Logic being that the downforce will press the suspension as much as it will allow it, and the car will be basically touching the ground and theoretically launching a lot more. But interestingly, when we did this, we did it 40 times. It only happened once, which is just 2.5% of the time. So even though the car is much lower now, it barely happened, which surprised me quite a lot. So let's try then with a high stiffness. So the same ride height, minimal ride height, 1-1 wide ride height, but with maximum stiffness. And actually, it happened a hell of a lot more. We tried it 38 times, but it happened 7 times. We got launched into the air 7 times. That's 18% of the time, so really significantly more there. So clearly it does seem to happen more with higher stiffness. Now my theory with this is that on that little access road, it does seem to be slightly lower. The car drops down when you hit that road, and I think with soft suspension it was just absorbing that dip much better and just allowing it to float over the bump, and the car didn't bottom out because the suspension was doing more work. With the stiff suspension, however, I suspect that the suspension just wasn't doing as much work. It was almost like running no suspension. So the car just wasn't absorbing that little drop more. It was diving into the drop and really smashing into the floor when it into the drop and then smashed the floor on that little bit that it raised up on. So not what I was expecting. The opposite I was expecting, in fact. But that does seem to be what happened. Next up then, I'm going to try and increase the downforce. Logic here being that the more downforce you have, the more the car gets pressed into the ground, the more the suspension gets compressed. Now I will say there is bump stops on a suspension, which means that is the maximum travel that the suspension will go. So obviously we don't know, we might already be at maximum suspension travel, but I thought I'd turn up the wings a bit anyway, and it actually did seem to make a difference. I did 47 tests with these 1111 wings, and I actually jumped the car 9 times, which is 19.1% of the time. That is the highest number we've seen so far, so really quite a lot of the time. Almost 1 in 5 of the time. 1 in 5 attempts is what I'm looking for. 1 in 5 attempts I was being launched into the air. So next up, we're going to try some tyre pressures. Now, judging on the same logic with the suspension, we're going to start with very high tyre pressures to make the car as stiff as possible, so that hopefully we'll hit that more often and we'll get it more often. But actually, tried 40 times, only got launched into the air 4 times. That's only 10% of the time. Much lower than I was expecting. So let's try then some low tyre pressures. Exactly the same, we lower the tyre pressures as low as possible. Logic here being that the tyre will be able to be squished more. So the downforce will squish the tyre more, and the car will theoretically be lower and it will hit the bump more. Again though, not the result I was expecting for this. We did it 43 times this one, and we only actually jumped twice, only 4.7% of the time. One of the lowest results. So those tyre pressures confused me. So what I've decided to do is completely remove the tyre pressures. The tyre pressures no longer matter. We're going to go back to the tyre pressure of the default setup that we were running before on the max wing setup, because those results are very inconclusive. That might have been unlucky that I got those, but regardless, they seem a bit fishy. I don't think it's having the results we were expecting. Perhaps the tyre pressures don't actually make a difference to the ride height of the car, maybe. I'm not too sure. But anyway, we're going to remove that. And then that gives us then our worst case scenario setup. Obviously there's more variables. I could have done thousands more tests on the various different possibilities within the setup, but I think we've reached there a fairly good worst case scenario with the max wing setup of 19%. Like I said, almost 1 in 5 attempts I was getting launched into the air. So with that then, we're going to run a few more tests. The first one is going to be a no DRS test. So we're actually going to just completely shut DRS just before we hit the bump, the launch point. And the reason we're doing it just before is to make sure that the speed stays quite similar to the previous test. We don't want the speed being different. But we shut the DRS, theory being that it's even more downforce. We saw the max wings test that it increased the probability of it happening. Theoretically with the DRS, shutting that should then increase the downforce and maybe lower the car. That isn't what we found. We did 35 tests and it happened 6 times. 17% of the time. It's still pretty high, but seemingly a little bit lower than the max wings, which surprised me. But I will say it did feel a little bit worse. Obviously, we've not, we'd love to run hundreds or even thousands of attempts on each of these tests. I already spent, best part of 2 hours recording this, so I'm not going to be spending even more time doing it. But it did, to me, feel a bit worse. Although those numbers are slightly better, actually, the way it rode the bumps, when it didn't launch into the air, a lot of times it was just getting jolted around more, it felt like, with no DRS. So we're going to stick with that. And next test then is going to be a braking test. So what I noticed when a lot of the esports guys were uploading videos of this happening, they were almost always hitting the brake right at the split second that they got the jump. So I actually tweeted Jan Otmir with this, and I actually said, I think it's the brakes. I think what's happening is you're hitting the brake, and as you do that, the car is getting compressed in some way, and it's causing you to bottom out and fly up into the air. And it seems random, but it's actually because you never brake at the same point. This game operates at 1,000 hertz. it calculates the handling 1,000 times a second. You're never going to brake at the same thousandth of a second, are you, every single lap? So that was my logic to begin with. And it did actually seem to be the case. When I was braking, hitting that point, I actually did the test 39 times. I actually jumped 8 times, which is 20.5% of the time. That is the highest yet. That is now over 1 in 5 attempts I was being launched into the air. So it did seem like the brakes were making things a little bit worse. I don't know whether that's actually true. I don't know whether that's true to real life. And again, these numbers aren't high enough to make that a conclusive result. But that did seem to be the case, that braking right on that point did seem to make some sort of difference. Obviously, if you're braking earlier, the car's going to slow down more. You're going to get less downforce, and it's going to make it better. This only applies when you're braking right at that launch point. So finally then, I just want to show you, obviously so far we have been using a dirty line, we've been off the track. I just wanted to show you that this can happen with a clean line. So this time I'm going to keep at least 2 wheels within the white line, and I'm just going to show you that you can still get launched. Now, to be fair, we tried this 24 times. I never got launched into the air completely like I was in the other tests, but we've seen the esports guys get it. So it does happen, and I did actually spin about 3 or 4 times because I was getting shaken around so violently with that aggressive setup that I was, just locking the tyres and spinning around. But it does seem to be, it is less likely when you're taking a clean line, so that probably exaggerates the esports kind of complaint of that it is random. It's 1 in 100. When you're taking a clean line, maybe it is actually 1 in 100, and it lowers the probability even more. But obviously we've seen it happen with a clean line. We know it can happen with a completely clean line. So that concludes the test then that we're going to run today. But what is the conclusion that we can take from this? Well, first of all, obviously we weren't trying to find a setup like, we're not implying that setup that we just found, the extreme setup, is the setup esports are running. We know it isn't. We know they wouldn't run that setup on purpose. But what we did find was that the setup does make a difference. Now that's important, because what we did find is that there is a setup available that makes it not happen at all. Okay, it would be very slow. An esports driver is never going to run a slow setup, even if it's perfectly stable. They'd always rather go for speed over stability. Not completely, but they would tend more towards speed than stability. So, but what we do know is it's affected by setup. It can be completely gotten rid of via setup. That's a good sign. That means it's not just a straight bug. It means it's not, there could have been a 1 meter high, invisible, 1 micron thick thing that's only very occasionally colliding with a certain part of the car. There could have been a really niche bug. We've ruled that out. The high setup was really nice. There isn't a weird bug that's going on. But what is going on then? Who is to blame? Is the game to blame? Should the game be changed to make it more consistent, or are the esports drivers just moaning a bit too much on this issue? Well, neither, in my opinion. For starters, I will say that the esports drivers, you can understand where they're coming from, right? Especially when they're doing clean laps. They've done, probably 100 laps, and it happens once, and that once happens to be during qualifying, or that once happens to be during one of their league races. I get it. It's a very low probability. It's frustrating. You're wondering why it's happened, etc., etc., etc. I understand the frustration. Even with my tests here, the percentages are fairly low, really. Bearing in mind that I'm trying to make it happen. That being said, the game these days is getting more and more realistic. And by more realistic, I mean more variables, because real life is filled with infinite variables. Real life in this exact corner, the car would never react the same coming into any corner, because there's differences in the weather, whether a cloud just happens to go overhead and it's very slightly changed the track temperature, differences in wind, very minor differences in your tyre pressure, differences in humidity. The car ahead could have just come and just dropped a few microns of oil. There's a million different things that could possibly happen on a real life racetrack. So a real life driver would never complain about something that just randomly happened. Well, they might, but then, these things happen in real life. We all know that things happen in real life. As the game moves closer and closer to real life, as there's more and more variables introduced, things are going to happen seemingly randomly, or more rarely. Because, if you've only got 5 variables being put into this, you can probably quite reliably predict those variables. If you've got 1,000 variables going into this thing, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen every single time. It's not going to be that consistent. So I will say, I think the esports drivers need to just kind of maybe realise that this game is no longer a game that is going to be perfect every leading lap. Perfection is no longer possible in the F1 series of games, I would say. There's too many variables now. That being said, I do think Codemasters need to at least investigate it. because you never know. They need to look at the data minutely, because you never know what could actually be happening here. The floor could actually be, the floor of the car could actually be going beneath the floor of the track very slightly and then glitching because it hits that bump and then it glitches higher. There could be a weird glitch there that obviously isn't right, that they need to address. Maybe, we don't know. From my findings, there doesn't seem to be an actual bug. That being said, maybe it needs to be adjusted slightly. I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, this is off the track, right? This is completely off the track. Esports drivers are using this line because it's the fastest line through the corner, but it carries a risk. I think they need to look into it just to figure out whether the profile of the track is right, whether that's how it should be, just to double check, really. But I don't think there's a lot, to be honest, that the game makers should fix. I mean, I think the key word today is risk. Esports drivers, even if it's a 1% or a less than a 1% chance, when they go over that bump, they are taking a risk that it's going to go wrong. They've done lots of practice. They know that there's a possibility this happens. It's been well published on Twitter. There's a risk. You're taking a risk by going over that, and sometimes that risk is going to go pay off. Again, I understand it's frustrating if it's such a rare risk, and it's annoying that it happens to you during an important race. That is frustrating. That does not mean it should be flattened or fixed in the game, in my opinion. As I said, as we get more realistic, these variables are only going to get worse as they have more and more variables to the game. These things are going to happen randomly more and more. So actually, for me, I think not much needs to be done, and I think there's no issue here. It is just, I guess, an issue with evolution of the game and of getting more and more complex. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think down in the comments of this issue. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.